Well, thanks for coming back to How Would You Beat? Today, we're going to do something I don't think we've done before, which is revisit a company. How would you beat Apple? The reason to do that is Apple this week hit $3 trillion market cap, the most valuable company in the world currently, and the most valuable to have ever existed. I'm pretty sure I have that right, that no other company has ever hit $3 trillion in valuation. So we talked about this back in 2014, where we tried to analyze Apple using jobs to be done theory and basic company valuation methods to figure out how much Apple was worth in 2014.
Yeah, so it was interesting. Back in 2014, when you were at the Post, Jay, Apple's market cap was $452 billion. And at the time, you thought that it ought to be worth $3.2 trillion. And I'll add that this wasn't really your opinion. You just walked through an analysis combining jobs to be done, market disruption theory, and Warren Buffett's intrinsic value model. And what's interesting is that there's an interesting article in Yahoo News that talks about how Carl Icahn sold too early. He got out of Apple in 2016, long before its valuation was $3 trillion. So how did your model work, Jay? How did you do that analysis, and how can that help companies and investors and companies figure out how much an investment is likely to be worth over time?
Yeah, and the interesting thing I think about this is this method, even though we were valuing a public company and its publicly traded equity, this actually is the same analysis that product teams should be doing. Because at the end of the day, they're making an investment to say, we're going to invest $100 million in this roadmap. What's our return on that investment going to be? Meaning, what revenue and profitability can you generate? So There's part of the analysis is just basic spreadsheet. If anybody wants the valuation model, email us, we'll send you the spreadsheet. It's really straightforward. It's kind of MBA 101, which is that a series of cash flows over time has an inherent value today because you discount it back. Technically, Buffett uses the 30-year treasury, I believe, as the discount rate. And so you're just trying to say, if someone paid you $100 every year for 10 years, how much is that worth? Well, it's not $1,000 because you got to discount back. $100 in year 10 is not the same as $100 in year 1. So pretty basic stuff. Right. The key then is you have to figure out how much profitability the company has. And that's not hard to do if you can read basic financial statements. You're really looking at free cash flow. So how much cash is available to what Buffett calls the owner's equity. So 100% of the company is owned by 100% of the shareholders, after they pay off the debt and interest rates and stuff. But then that cash is technically owned by the shareholders. So they could distribute it all, except that companies reinvest it and grow. And so you're looking at that owner's earning number, as Buffett calls it. And that's basically your profitability model. It's your profits, in simple terms. So then you have to look at two different innovation theories. One is market disruption, where companies are able to grow, but then a competitor enters the market with a product that gets the job done worse technically and then takes over market share. So there's some disruption theory there. But the key really is, do you believe the company is in big enough markets to grow? And remember, back in 2014, being a $450 billion company was ginormous. I mean, Apple was already huge. And this, to your point about Carl Icahn, this is why big investors got out. They're like, it can't keep growing. You can't be more than $1 trillion company. It's never happened. You'd never make 3 times your money if you invested in Apple at $1 trillion valuation.
Yeah. I think I remember even at the time it was jockeying with Exxon for most valuable company in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. My favorite story about the day that they became the most valuable company in the world was the day my dad finally got off of all of his Windows products. He'd been a DOS and Windows user forever, which was a sign, right, that Apple was getting some jobs done.
Yeah. So to go back a second, you mentioned that you can calculate the profits and understand the cash flow, and that gives you an understanding of how much the company should be valued today. And then the second key piece is, do you believe those profits will grow over time or at least be maintained, right?
That's right. That's right. And, as you and I say, and we tell the companies we work with all the time, how do you know that the roadmap isn't BlackBerry, that it's actually the iPhone? So that is the unknown mystery. So the key in all of this analysis is the growth rate. Because obviously in BlackBerry's case, the growth went negative. When your growth goes negative, you go from an $80 billion market cap like BlackBerry to zero, effectively. So the growth rate is everything. And Buffett said this too. He says growth and value are tied to the hip, because when you're discounting back those cash flows, you're looking at how much of those cash flows going to grow. And if they're going to shrink, then you should short the stock. So that's the analysis that says, what is behind that growth rate? And there is nothing better at doing this type of thinking and analysis than Jobs to be done, in our opinion, obviously. But it's not that it's hard to do. It's just a different type of thinking about what companies that are building products, it's thinking differently about why are those products valuable to people in their lives. That's the key question. And what it turns out, if companies are very good at thinking of themselves as living in their customers' shoes, that they really are empathizing with the struggles and the problems of their customers, and they're trying to make things simpler, that's an indication that they're likely really going to succeed. Because at the end of the day, it's about customers. It is about customer value. It's about helping people in their lives. And you could look at Apple in 2014 and say, they just took a different approach to everybody else. They took a different approach to go, especially in the technology world, they took an approach to go right to the end consumer. And that is true. There are only consumer markets and business markets and medical markets. At the end of the day, every market is a group of people. So they decided, IT managers were not the people. That wasn't like a real human thing to be an IT manager. It was this brief period when technology was very complicated, as we would say in the consumption jobs, were very complicated, but you had to have these job executors. So it went with the theory very well, because it said, we're going to go to the patient, right? We're going right to the person who has the problem, and we're going to solve it for them and try and eliminate all these other barriers to solving these problems for them. That's why there's an app for that was so successful, because a phone is a small supercomputer that can get a lot of jobs done.
So I think that what you're raising brings up a couple of interesting questions. So one is you talked about how you're trying to figure out if your roadmap is going to generate growth. And I think when you're thinking about a 1, 2, 3 year investment time horizon, then you can do that, right? You can evaluate what is the company planning to build and think about, is that going to get the job done better in our language, or in much simpler language, is it going to generate any value for the customers or not? And is it going to be competitors? And what's interesting about this Apple growth story over the past is that it's an 8-year time horizon that we're talking about. So from 2014 to 2022, you were essentially stretching a much longer time horizon. Apple didn't know what it was going to launch in 2021 back in 2014, and we didn't either. And so you did mention that you're betting on the company's process as well. And I think that's an interesting distinction to make, is that there's the roadmap, and then there's how the roadmap is generated and what the follow-on ideas are going to be and how the company's approaching doing that. So how does that play into an analysis like you did with Apple?
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's really that team coordination on the roadmap. Do you feel that the team is really aligned around the customer? So that, road mapping is an ongoing, never-ending process. You're constantly trying to figure out what the path is to continue to innovate. And I think that having that process where you're answering every one of those questions, which is, what are we doing for our customers? How much value are we creating? What should we prioritize? What should we be focused on? What should we not do, right? What should we not stop doing that we're currently doing? Steve Jobs was famous for this too. He said, he was as proud of all the things they said no to as he was of all the products that actually ended up shipping. This is true of great thinkers. I was just thinking about this the other day. I was talking to my daughter about it. People think that Jimi Hendrix was a great guitar player. Of course, he was this amazing, and he had these incredible 3 albums that he put out. But he also had a huge library of stuff that he didn't put out, and people thought they'd found the Hendrix archive and they were going to launch, all this great stuff. But all the archives were all the things that he said no to. He was like, "That's terrible. I don't like that song. I know I'm Jimi Hendrix, but not everything I do is great." So knowing what to say no to is incredibly important as well. And I think
there's a great section in the Walter Isaacson book about that, where Steve Jobs would get up in front of the company in Hawaii once a year and write down the top 10 ideas and then cross off 7. No matter how good the 10 ideas were, 7 of them were going to go away because he thought they could only do 3 things well every year.
Yeah, and that right there, that doubles your chance of success. That's so hard to do because everybody wants to do everything. Everyone wants to be everything to everybody. It's crazy. Right. Segment. That's what we always say. You got to segment. So to answer your question about process too, the key I think is getting in there's 2 parts of the mindset. One is you're not building a product so your customers will use it. The ideal scenario is that they never use your product. They just get the job done, right?
Yeah.
So that's the most important thing. Unless you really are in like the creative arts. People want to watch television shows and movies. They want to read books. They want to get immersed in music. Those are examples.
We call them immersive jobs, right?
Immersive
Things you
jobs.
want to spend
That's right.
time doing.
That's right. But so many markets, people do not want to use your product. They want to achieve their goal, which is get the job done. So that's the first mindset. The second thing against that is everything should be measured for speed and accuracy. If those are the only 2 metrics you really need, if you are getting something done faster and more accurate than your competitors, you're going to get the job done better for your customer and you're going to take share over time. And if you think about what Apple did, just across its history, you could measure speed and accuracy, right? I remember, my dad was a DOS Windows guy and I was a Apple guy. I was Apple II guy. And then the Mac came out. And my dad thought it was a toy. He was literally like, it smiles at you when it starts up. It's got this pointy thing. Like, he literally described it as a toy. And I couldn't articulate why it was better. But as a kid, I was like, this thing is so much better than this green blinking screen where I have to type in text. I was like, this is cool. I can draw images. I can play music. And what it was that the Mac, especially at the OS level, just at the OS level, got everything done faster and more accurately. You could drag things into folders. Files went into folders instead of like C-:directory,
Right.
So it was always faster and more accurate. That was their mission. And that has been true if you look across, their entire history. So in this analysis, it wasn't hard to see that Apple had already put in place the combination of disruption. They disrupted themselves. They destroyed the iPod before anybody else could. Unlike Sony, who hung on to the Walkman for way too long and just lost share. I mean, remember, the Sony Walkman was the iPod of the day.
Yeah,
I'm revealing my age.
I think what's interesting is like you can sense signals in that culture. So if you're thinking about, those 2 characteristics you talked about, which are making sure that you're not trying to get the customers to use the product all the time, and you're focused on speed and accuracy. How quickly and accurately can you get something important done for the customer, help them achieve a goal quickly and accurately? And you can see signals in the way that Apple develops and launches products that they're not afraid of that. So the obvious one is the iPhone beating the iPod, right? Basically making the iPod extinct. And if you read about that, you'll find that there was a lot of turmoil around that decision, and they had to sequester the team, and they ended up following a lot of Clay Christensen's advice about how you disrupt yourself. Isolate a team, make sure they have a different set of goals and different incentives than the core business, and then you have a chance to disrupt yourself. I think the other thing you can see it is in little ways.
Yeah,
so,
and I do want to come back to that, so let's not forget that, because that isolated team thinking differently is so crucial.
Yeah. So you can see it in little ways with Apple too. So if they were obsessed with, I couldn't imagine Facebook launching something that said, here's how much time you spent on Facebook this month. Try spending less time, right? Which
Right.
Apple has now. Like my iPhone every week tells me, here's how much time you spent. And if I spent less time, they don't go, uh-oh. They don't
Yeah.
bombard me with notifications to try to spend more time. They sort of quietly celebrate it. And
Yeah.
you would be incredibly afraid to do that if you had the culture that Facebook has, where they measure on your success based on usage and time spent with the product. So I think you can see in the culture that they have the customer's well-being in mind. One other thing, we talked about. So we've got cash flow, we've got process, and those are really important things that help you value a company, right? To determine do they have a roadmap that's going to help growth, and do they have a process that's going to drive growth. I think the other interesting thing when you said, that's why there's an app for that was so powerful, is the platform. So you can think about how the App Store platform plus the iPhone plus the other products, like every now and then you'll see my watch in the screen, work together to help customers get more jobs done. And you can look at the extensibility of that platform and its ability to expand beyond its current value for the customer, and think through, if they build the right applications on top of that and the right feature set and they make the right deals, are they likely to generate growth or not, right? If they're going to get more jobs done, they're very likely to generate growth, and they have a distinct platform that enables them to do that. So I think that's another key piece. Whereas if you looked at the BlackBerry, they didn't have an app store. They weren't very extensible. They had apps that didn't really do much beyond messaging, and so it was hard to see how they were going to grow beyond the core jobs that they were good at.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And in the platform question is such an interesting one. And this is how I think people underestimate the size of the markets that Apple's going after, because it's not the market for phones. There's no
Right.
market for phones. There's no market for iPods. Yes, people are technically purchasing a thing called an iPhone, but they're hiring it to get so many jobs done in their lives. And that is the idea behind, Marc Andreessen's software eating the world, which I think is a silly, phrase. But what it implies, or what it's really about, is software can get so many jobs done better than humans, and better than some manual process they're using. If you want to stay healthy, it's easier to have an app that tells you this is what I need to exercise you today. This is, your watch to tell you what, your activity level is, et cetera. And we know, because Phil Schiller has talked about this publicly, that Apple asks themselves, what job is the watch getting done? And what jobs can the phone get done? What jobs can the iPad get done? What jobs is a MacBook and then an iMac Pro? And that is a great way to build that multi-platform, multi-job, unbelievably defensible moat. Back to Buffett, one of his premises is do you have a defensible moat as a business? Is it just
Right.
Are you selling, wheat, which is a pure commodity, and your wheat is not different than my wheat. My pound of sugar
Right.
is a pound of sugar. It is pure undifferentiated with no moat. Now, maybe a distribution or business model, but in innovation moats, you want to have multiple jobs you're getting done for the customer, and you want to make sure you understand each of the products that you're building and what their capabilities are against the job. Because
Right.
you're never going to mix a multi-track, recording session on a watch. Maybe someday, but currently not today. So that's how you make these platform decisions, is when you're looking at your customer's job, you say okay, well, can the technology do it today? And you want to take almost no risk. This is what I think teams also really should adopt from the Apple lesson, is Apple actually takes very, very little risk, because what they're doing today is optimizing around what customers are doing today, and then looking forward to what the next capability is going to be able to do. But they don't have a VR system yet. They don't have a talking robot that shows up in your living room. They don't even have a self-driving car, because they want to be at that moment that the technology actually can get the job done much faster and more accurately. And if it isn't there, that was the era of the Newton. I owned, a bunch of Newtons, so I was a, sucker. And it was a bad product. It was way too early. You couldn't do
Yeah.
the type of, touch, recognition that you could do with faster processors. So
Right.
it failed, right? It wasn't a great product because they got out of sync. But Apple they don't miss that now, right? They're
Right. I mean, they've famously launched products second, but
Yeah.
they get the job done well first, right? Which, a lot of startups forget. They think the first mover's advantage is going to be everything, but it's really the first mover is who moves to get the job done incredibly well best, not who launches a technology or product first. And Apple
Yeah.
really understands that.
Yeah, and you could tell that they were using this jobs to be done type thinking. They were thinking about disruption, and they were generating a ton of cash. So like they had all of the elements of a high valuation company. And the other thing is they were valued at a lower multiple than Google, and yet they were just
Right.
this incredible machine.
So to
Sorry,
talk
go ahead.
about that market size, that I think that's a really interesting point to lean into for a second, because you said, if you were sizing the phone market, you would have gotten it all wrong, and it's almost counterintuitive, right? Because you think, well, if we're sizing Apple's market opportunity in 2014, we're going to look at how much are they charging for phones and computers, and how many people have the willingness to pay or the wherewithal to pay that much for a phone or a computer. And if you said, well, we're going to max out at when we fully penetrate that segment that can afford to spend this much on these phones and computers, you would have been way off on their opportunity to generate revenue, because you would have completely missed the billions of dollars in services they're making today. And Apple's very good at saying, we're not selling this product yet, but we believe we can get a certain job done. We believe we can get jobs done in health. And then we can sell something that's going to generate revenue once we start getting that job done really well. Whether it's the hardware we're going to sell, in the case of the watch getting health jobs done, so they're selling a hardware into it, or subscriptions and services, or a platform and taking a cut of the revenue generated by developers. There's a lot of ways they're making money today that have not nothing to do with the phone, but are extensions of the cost of the phone.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I mean, this goes back to the famous Steve Ballmer moment at the iPhone launch, when he was like, $600 for a phone. No one's going to pay that. That's like a almost beautifully perfect jobs to be done example, because as the theory shows, Steve Ballmer's right. No one would pay $600 for a phone. They weren't buying the iPhone to be a phone. That's the whole point.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, Steve, it has phone in the name, but that's not what it's doing. It's a tiny supercomputer. The fact that he couldn't see that, I mean, it's incredible for a pioneer in, the technology industry. So yeah, it's so true. They're just, and it's not even about the phone. Like I sincerely hope there's a day in the future when I never pick up a phone, a brick, thing like that, and spend too much hours in the day on it. I do think Apple's recognizing that like there's some serious societal problems with people using apps, not Apple apps. I agree that Apple doesn't, they don't have a social networks with divisive algorithms, amplifying everybody's hatred around the world, like some of their, fellow Silicon Valley companies. So there's a lot of benefit to that. I also, frankly, think Apple can just do so much more for communities of people. Maybe that's asking too much of them, but why not? They're the most valuable company in the world. We need help. Like humans are, I would assess humans are a bit unhealthy, certainly in the United States. I mean, they're literally physically unhealthy. We're financially unhealthy. We have, jobs and career problems, education problems. I mean, there's no shortage of problems to solve. And, thinking outside of the box, to use a cliche, obviously, but outside of the phone, like those problems are enormous markets. And they're going to be digitally connected to something that's going to help improve in all those different markets. So Apple's, market opportunity is just is enormous.
Yeah, I'm a very extremely minor shareholder in Apple, but I will not sell that stock until they start saying no to giant markets.
Yeah.
Right. Like right now, they're saying yes to health. They're saying yes to other really large, complex jobs that, if you were a phone company, you wouldn't get into. And Apple says, no, let's take it on. Maybe it's not a phone that is the best thing to solve that problem for you. We'll figure out what it is. And that is a hallmark of a company that's has a lot of growth potential left.
Yeah. And, not to just use social networks as our, big competitor today, but why not, right? Apple has never done well in social networks. They've never done anything socially very well, except for music. Now, I will caveat that like they create a creative market. I do believe that's still a core part of their DNA is helping artists, musicians, writers, filmmakers, producers, creative artists, designers, architects. Like the creative community is still, highly Apple focused, which is so wonderful. And that creates a lot of markets, right? Like music is entirely different today and completely outside of the stranglehold of 5 music companies because, the combination obviously of the internet, but plus Apple just, for $190, you could have an entire recording studio that's 1,000 times better than whatever the Beatles recorded on. Totally. And then push a button and distribute it all over the world, right? It's amazing. And Apple's a huge enabler of this, which is obviously incredible.
Yeah, and I would say that, though they haven't built or really gotten into the social network game, right? They haven't built that product. They are enabling connection 1 million times a day, every day, right? Like people using a million is a vast understatement, but just 1 million times in my own life, right? Between messages, FaceTime, and the actual phone, I'm connecting with people, getting that job done way more with Apple than I am with Facebook.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I'm also not a social network person for just a lot of reasons. I have my friends and my family social network, and that's all done on Apple devices. So there is this kind of I don't know if you call it private, but it's not public. So yeah, there is that social connection. It was great. I do think it's really interesting. Everybody talks about how great it would be Apple to make an autonomous car. Okay. That could be interesting. I think we've talked about Tesla. Tesla's doing an amazing job. And sure, all cars should get better and be electric and automated and safe and, all great stuff. Whether or not Apple could do that, I wouldn't prioritize cars for Apple. I would prioritize much more meaningful markets. And health is definitely one of them. But I would extend health into mental health and physical health and social health and emotional well-being and educational health and career advancement. Like those big areas, I think are so much more interesting for innovation that fundamentally revolves around software. And Apple makes great, hardware, but of course, I think there's some great Steve Jobs phrase of, anybody who wants to make great software has to make their own hardware. But at the end of the day, he recognized it was software. Like no one wants a brick of glass and CPU, right? They want it to do something. And that I think is still extraordinary opportunity. Now, whether that they do it, I don't know. There's we can't get a look inside their roadmaps to say what is their strategy with autonomous cars. But I think the reason the 2014 prediction worked well is that jobs to be done is very accurate. If you analyze Apple against its competitors thinking, are they more jobs to be done focused than their competitors? The answer is 100% yes. And that is, I think, a key differentiation. Even if you look at Google, a great company, with a lot of stuff, but some crazy other issues, obviously, but they're an ad-driven company. They are just 100%, that's where all their revenue comes from. So it is a different relationship to getting jobs done because they're getting jobs done that, get you information. Now, to their credit, too, the beauty of search is that you get exactly what you want. You're not going through some, disinformation,
And for businesses trying to acquire customers, it gets that job done very successfully in comparison to other solutions out there.
Yeah, and it totally did change advertising for businesses. You can track how much, instead of the crazy 50% of advertising works, you just don't know which 50%, the cliche, now 100% what are your advertising working. That's very efficient. But so, I do think Apple, in its position as helping the consumer, its privacy initiatives are fantastic. And so I think those are, bigger opportunities than cars, which cars is a huge market. So, that's true, but I'd really rather see them make a difference in more meaningful jobs. So great questions, tons to talk about Apple always. And if you want to learn more about Thrive and Jobs to be Done, the theory behind this, reach out to us at thrv.com. Thanks.